Today we're going to be talking about a controversial topic. This is a follow-up video to the video I did recently on how autism was reversed. And since then, I received certain information from some people about unknown or very little known theory proposed, scientific theory proposed, what might be causing autism. Because remember, we still actually don't know what is causing autism. This is still a bit of an unknown. And this is a bit of a taboo topic, I gotta tell you, I gotta warn you. Although I betcha I think I know what you're thinking, but it's not what you're thinking. So I'm about to tell you what the taboo topic is indeed. And basically, this theory has been, this is what I'm getting from studying this information. This theory has been formulating for many, many, many years, but it's receiving very little attention, scientific or medical attention. And as a consequence, it's just a hypothesis. I'm not sure if I am convinced with whether this could be true or not because of the type of evidence that's available or lack thereof. However, it's very, very interesting, very, very interesting. But what's even more interesting for me personally is that the authors of these articles were the people that I'm currently collaborating with writing scientific articles. So I was definitely super interested in that, and I definitely wanted to investigate that information and see what they wrote. I really love working with these scientists because these group of people are the type of people who want to investigate science, medical information, and see how we could be improving our available interventions. That's actually a very difficult job, very hard thing to do, because sometimes you have to be brave and willing to point out that there might be mistakes or issues, and that's not an easy thing to do. So I definitely enjoy working with these people, and therefore I was very keen to study this. Now, what is this controversial, this taboo topic? Yes, it talks about connection between vaccines and autism, but not that vaccines are causing autism. So let's skip that part right away, and I'll explain that later on as well as to what is the evidence we have that vaccines do not cause autism directly. Rather, it's a subcomponent of some of the vaccines, aluminum adjuvants, and I'll explain everything about that, that might eventually be stored in the brain and start interfering with a certain immune processes during the brain development called autophagy. You might be familiar with the word autophagy when it comes to fasting, but it's also involved in brain development, and it might prevent proper trimming of nerve cells during development, and as a consequence there might be too many brain connections inside the brain. So that's the proposed theory. Very, very interesting. So I'm gonna tell you everything about it. Brace yourself, this is gonna be a longer video because there's a lot of information to share with you. It's really, really, really interesting, and let's get started. My name is Dr. Mikhail Rashik of Genomics, by the way, and let's break this all down. So, by the way, just to let you know, the first paper I read, I was curious, who's been quoting that paper even? It seemed like that review that promoted this hypothesis, that's not even their own. They're just simply recounting information that scientists have been already building up over the years. And basically, it was published in some obscure paper. It's probably no one even knows about it. I betcha many of you, if not most of you, have never really even heard about this theory either. If you have, please let me know in the comments below whether you've ever heard of this theory or not, which parts of the theory you might have already heard about versus which one you haven't. I'd be curious to know. It is truly seems obscure to me, and I never heard of it either. And I wanted to see who referenced that paper, and I only found one other paper that ever referenced the paper I read, and it actually included one of the authors as well. So one of the authors was involved in two reviews, pretty much the same topic. So I studied both of these papers, and everything I'm going to be telling you today is amalgamation of these two reviews, okay? And both of these, of course, are available for for you in the video description. Okay, so the first paper I was reading, the authors mentioned, look, we have vaccines now for approximately 25 different pathogens. And they state right away, clearly vaccines have over the years saved millions and millions of lives. There is no question on this. This is not an attack on vaccines at all. Rather, this is basically looking at available information on how we can make our amazing interventions even better. They even mentioned in one of these articles that it's somewhat unfair that oftentimes when people look at potential issues, especially related to these aluminum adjuvants, that there are unfairly labeled anti-vaxxers, whereas they are not. They don't deny that there is lots of empirical evidence showing that vaccines over the years have literally saved millions of lives. There is no denying that. But we can make them better, and we need to look at the information and make them better. And the reason why is because these adjuvants, and I'll explain everything to you right away what that is, have not been developed almost at all over the years. So, and I'll tell you all about it, right? So, but then what are these adjuvants? So first of all, when you think of vaccines are basically, vaccine will have some sort of a delivery vehicle that will deliver either an antigen. An antigen is something that obviously is supposed to provoke our immune system in order to respond to it. So antigen is something that we want our immune system to recognize in order to mount later attack against a pathogen. So that's an antigen, okay? So then the vaccine vehicle will deliver either an antigen or genetic material that tells the body how to build that antigen, right? So then that's one thing. But typically, these antigens are not very powerful enough in order to actually trigger immune response from our body. It's just they just simply don't cut it. And as a consequence, we inject other elements as well, and these are adjuvants, which they themselves then trigger immunological response. And adjuvants comes from a Latin word that, and I'm gonna try to tell you, even though I don't know anything about Latin, I think it's something like adjuvare, which means something like to assist or to help. And that's exactly what they do. Adjuvants, basically, they help vaccine send a danger signal to the immune system and basically rally the immune response to the site of injection. And that's ultimately what starts the immunological response. The vast majority historically of these adjuvants, and that still remains to this day, have been aluminum-based adjuvants, or aluminium if you prefer. I'm gonna say aluminum. Either, no matter how I say it, it's not gonna be correct. So I'm gonna say aluminum. And aluminum-based adjuvants, the going theory was that what they do is they form like a mesh, what they refer to them as depots. And these depots, they basically create like a three-dimensional lattice outside the cell that attracts and captures these antigens. And the ongoing theory is that these antigens are then slowly released over time, and it's the slow release of these antigens from the adjuvants that eventually can help or can really promote activation of the immune system, even for antigens that are weakly immunogenic, meaning they're actually not very good at stimulating the immune system reaction, but with the help of adjuvants, this is what happens. And the aluminum component of the adjuvant eventually was also believed that it dissolves into ions, and once it's an ion, then we have no problem to excrete it. Okay, so that was the theory. Now the ongoing theory over years and years and years and decades really was the fact that adjuvants are safe. And they mentioned that the reason why, it's gonna get loud here because we have basically a bunch of school kids coming to the royal castle, And the ongoing theory why adjuvants were considered to be safe is for three reasons. Number one was the fact that the amount of aluminum that you inject in vaccine is just simply too little to ever be toxic. And I'll break this all down for you. Number two was that the aluminum in the vaccine shot was also similar composition to the aluminum you would naturally get from your diet, which is basically where you're going to get most of aluminum ever, right? And then number three was the ongoing theory that once you have the aluminum from the vaccine, you will excrete it in the same fashion as you would excrete the aluminum from diet. So now I'm going to breaking down all of these for you one by one. And let's go with the first one, that the amount of aluminum in the vaccine shot is just simply too little to ever be a concern. And that was basically what was believed for decades and decades, and still is the main belief. But these authors of this review reminded us of this paper that came out just in 2017. And in that study in 2017, a bunch of scientists took mice and they injected them with aluminum-based adjuvants, and they injected them with three different amounts. They injected them with 200 micrograms of aluminum-based adjuvants per kilogram body weight. That's just a unit. Obviously, a mouse does not weigh a kilogram, it's per kilogram. Versus 400 micrograms per kilogram body weight versus 800 micrograms per kilogram body weight, okay? And they analyzed these mice 180 days post-vaccination, and what they found was interesting in that it was the mice that were injected with the lowest amount of aluminum adjuvants that exhibited the following, and versus the ones with higher amounts did not exhibit these symptoms. Number one, they had behavioral symptoms changes. So they basically became less social, and they exhibited greater anxiety, for example. This is number one. Number two, they also exhibited greater microglial cells activation inside their brains. Now, microglial cells are the type of immune cells that are found in your brain, and they basically are there to maintain proper function in your brain. There's lots of them, and this will be key to the story as well. So keep that in mind. So this is actually important. And number three, these mice with the lowest amount of aluminum adjuvant injected also exhibited the highest amount of aluminum inside these mice brains. Okay, so this suggests that, and because these mice have obviously also behavioral changes, this suggests that it's the small amounts that can get to the brain and cause behavioral changes versus higher amounts are prevented from being transferred to the brain. And that is because it turns out, and I'll explain this as well, that immune cells called macrophages can swallow up small particles of aluminum. And macrophages are the type of immune cells that can clean up things. So there are monocytes. Monocytes can be differentiated into either macrophages or dendritic cells. All of these are phagocytes. So they perform phagocytosis. Phagocytes basically, and phagocytosis means a swallowing up something. So let's say if a cell is being sick and needs to be destroyed, it can be swallowed up, or a pathogen can be swallowed up by these cells. They will literally destroy what these cells, the immune cells, swallow up, and then they can start presenting fragments of it to the immune system or other cells for like warning. And macrophages are more leaning towards maintenance of the body, and then dendritic cells are specialized for warning and activating our immune system. I gotta show you this guy behind me. Right, this is a guy that obviously you would probably know what it means, but I love the description here. It says that he was trimming unwelcome growths in allusion to trimming and maintaining the park. I really like the description. That was fun for kids. Anyway, so it turned out that macrophages can swallow aluminum adjuvants and they can transfer it throughout the body to other organ sites from the site of injection, and that includes the brain. That has been worked out eventually, and I'll get to this as well. So this is basically what this means, is that the authors refer to this as a Trojan horse mechanism, so that specific small amounts of aluminum could be grabbed by immune cells and delivered elsewhere. So hence the Trojan horse from, of course, the mythology, where you deliver something dangerous hidden inside of course, the Trojan horse. In this case, it's these macrophage immune cells that are the Trojan horse, because they deliver this deadly cargo to the brain. So and why is that an issue? And because aluminum adjuvants, eventually it was worked out that once they are inside the brains, they can be problematic because they will be neurotoxic. And this is why, the authors mention, over the years, last almost 60 years, there's been more and more concerns about aluminum adjuvants leading to neurological conditions in people, so much so that industry is even now responding. So there is a happy ending to some degree to all of this, is because the pharmaceutical industry is indeed responding, and there is now search for novel adjuvants, and we'll get to that as well. So yeah, there is this option now, this new theory. We went from a paradigm that is all safe, that new theory that perhaps these aluminum particles could be delivered to the brain via immune cells. So that's number one. Number two, the composition is the same. Well, if you get the aluminum from food, it's actually different than the aluminum in adjuvants, because the aluminum in the food is soluble. So it can get inside your blood easily, it can swim inside your blood, and you easily excrete it. And there's lots of data showing that aluminum from food is rapidly excreted. You can trace it with radioactive aluminum. This has even been done in humans, apparently, where you just inject radioactive aluminum. This allows you to really easily trace its journey throughout the body. And basically within, say, a couple of weeks, 85% of it is excreted completely, 83% is via urine, few percent, this was about 3% via number two, and 15% of aluminum can be retained for longer in your body. 4% they mentioned was retained in such radioactive aluminum, soluble aluminum was retained in these people for even almost 1,200 days. So small amounts can be retained for a long time, presumably because they can end up in bones. But the vast majority of soluble aluminum is excreted. That's not the case actually with the aluminum adjuvants, because they're not soluble. The reason why we cannot use aluminum from food as an adjuvant is precisely because it doesn't form solid. It's soluble, versus adjuvants, they do form solid particles. And the ongoing theory is that these particles, so they're not the same properties, right? The ongoing theory was that these particles eventually get dissolved and excreted, but they're definitely not the same properties because they're not soluble. So that's number two. And as a consequence, soluble aluminum cannot absorb antigens, hence you need those adjuvants. All right, so then that brings us to point number three, and that's the excretion criteria, right? That how rapidly do we excrete it in comparison to the aluminum from food. And here, basically, the idea is as follows. So we just already told you how it's excreted with soluble aluminum. And this deposit theory has been debunked. It was debunked for the first time around the year 2000. So it took us decades, literally decades, to debunk a theory that had no scientific backing we just simply, it appears to me that we simply liked the theory and we went with the theory. and the theory lasted for decades before it finally got debunked with scientific evidence. And the reason why is because once these aluminum adjuvant particles get inside immune cells, well, they're no longer available to be dissolved, and they're trapped, and then they can be spread around the body. And then they mentioned a few years ago, this theory was finally rejected, those depot theory that we basically lived with for decades and decades as untrue, okay? And right now, it's understood that basically something else is happening. It's the immune cells that grab and swallow the adjuvants, and this is how ultimately the antigens then are responsible for triggering the immune system. It's via the fact that the immune cells literally swallow these cells. So that theory was completely debunked after decades of being assumed to be correct without any evidence. And so now we have a new paradigm that this Trojan horse mechanism, that aluminum is captured by immune cells and then it's being delivered to other body parts, including the brain. Okay, so now with that, let's maybe break down the history of these adjuvants a bit. So the concept of aluminum-based adjuvants was described for the very first time in, I think it was 1926, by this guy Alexander Checiny, I believe. And its first use as an aluminum-based adjuvant in a vaccine was, I think it was mentioned 1932. Strong wind. I should get out of here. And aluminum-based adjuvants have been used exclusively inside vaccines for nearly 7 years since. So it took us decades and decades to even come up with other available options. All right, so, and the author mentioned that the development of vaccine adjuvants is the slowest medical progress in history. It's that slow. We simply went with these adjuvants, aluminum-based adjuvants, and the only reason why we finally started looking at other options is because of this slow evidence, crumb by crumb evidence, suggesting that maybe this is not the best way to go. So then, in about 1960s, finally the FDA approved how much of aluminum can be used in vaccines, and they settled on about up to 850 micrograms per vaccine shot, or 0.85 milligrams, if that's an easier number for you. And however, they had absolutely no evidence for safety. That was never investigated how safe that might be. Neither was investigated how much aluminum should be dosed per body weight of the child. What was also never investigated is what multiple vaccine shots simultaneously could be doing in terms of safety. And again, the kinetics, or basically the biological journey of these aluminum adjuvants inside the body, was also never investigated. We just simply assume that it's going to be all fine. And that basically what happened with the biological journey of these adjuvants was simply a scientific knowledge gap. And we have many of these scientific knowledge gaps. If you follow my channel, I think that's one of the common messages I'm trying to propagate, is that we often actually don't know what's happening biologically. We just assume. We have a lot of science knowledge gaps, and a lot of information that we discuss is based on assumptions. And the same thing has been happening during the pandemic as well. So that's actually more common than people realize, unfortunately. All right, so, and one more thing, then this is probably also a good point to bring up. Why hasn't this been discovered or looked at before? And 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 the concept that it has been investigated that vaccines do not cause autism, and it's true, but that's based on specific types of vaccines. Aluminum adjuvants have never been investigated really for that, and the vaccines that have been looked at almost always have been the ones that do not have aluminum adjuvants in them. They would have something else, so such as measles, mumps, and rubella. So this is how you can have information that vaccines do not cause autism, but we have not looked whether cumulative microdosing of aluminum adjuvants via vaccinations could be causing a problem. All right, so then finally the first reports that aluminum adjuvants could be causing problems started to emerge in the 70s, usually based on issues with local site injection, and where it really found like a big transformation of knowledge came is in the 90s. And really the first issues started to appear in early 90s in Canada. In fact, my home country, although that's not where I am right now. We don't have medieval castles in Canada. and that was because that was the fact that people started to exhibit myalgic encephalomyelitis. I can never pronounce that word properly. Basically, this is the chronic fatigue syndrome. People started to exhibit these symptoms after hepatitis B injections. All right. At the same time, we had the Gulf War syndrome, and this was basically showing that people who had veterans who had numerous vaccines were showing chronic fatigue-like syndromes as symptoms as well, in comparison to veterans who did not get vaccinated. In 1997, it was shown that intravenous injection or feeding solution that included aluminum ions to preterm babies, that can lead to brain developmental issues if the baby gets of it too much of it. And then in the late 90s, another unusual side effect of aluminum adjuvant-based vaccines was discovered, and it was called something like macrophagic myofasciitis, something like that. Maybe it was fasciitis. These names, the key though is the word macrophagic, and the reason why is because again it has to do with these macrophages, right? So what do I mean by that? So remember, these macrophages, these immune cells that can swallow up things, phagocytose things, and they can swallow up these aluminum adjuvants. And this was discovered. This is why the side effect was called how it was called, is because it turned out that these macrophages were swallowing up the aluminum adjuvants, and it was observed both in adults and in children. And this was the first clue in the late 90s that the depot theory and how aluminum is excreted out of our body is not even true. So it took us decades and deeper investigation of these symptoms to finally come to the conclusion, oh, wait a minute, we might be wrong with this theory. We might be completely wrong with this theory. And indeed, further studies showed that that's what's happening. And it's happening that basically once you inject aluminum adjuvant in the body, pretty much most of it stays in the body for a long period of time. These immune cells grab it and then transport it around the body. Okay, that Trojan horse mechanism. So that's how long it took, decades and decades of slow investigation to finally remove a theory that was based on nothing. Oh well, right? Okay, so that was late 90s, and then they also mentioned in early 2000s another interesting side effect was shown. How do they call it? They called it autoimmunity, inflammation, adjuvant-induced syndrome, or something like that, or syndrome induced by adjuvants, aluminum adjuvants, or Asia, something like that. And basically we're talking about how these aluminum adjuvants can also lead in certain circumstances to autoimmunity. Now, so how is this all linked to, say, now autism? Now, autism, as we discussed in the previous video, we don't know what's causing it yet, but it clearly points that there's some environmental factor involved. So why is that? Because we changed the diagnostic criteria for how we diagnose autism a long time ago, but the rate is increasing, and also the age of diagnosis doesn't change, while the rate increases when we diagnose these kids is pretty steady, and it's usually around 50th month of child's life. And we do know that neurotoxins can also exacerbate autism as well. So clearly, there is a evidence points that environmental factors are probably causing autism. Now, a lot of genetic work has been done, and it's actually quite incredible. The authors remind us that it's getting windy. The authors remind us that more than 100 genes have been figured out to be involved in autism, and many mutations, large effect mutations, meaning like mutations that clearly point to helping develop autism. And it's all true, right? No denying that there's a genetic component. But as you'll see, if I remember to tell you this later, a lot of these genes are also involved in the immune system function, and immune system is like the system of our body that obviously meets the outside environment as well, right? So there's that. So then what could be that environmental component? And it could be the fact that there could be the aluminum adjuvants that are present in certain vaccines. So what are we talking about? So they mentioned that in 1970s there were 10 childhood vaccines available, and that by 2010 there was 32 childhood vaccines available that we're now injecting children with, and 18 of those include the aluminum adjuvants in them. Okay, and some of them are provided to a child immediately after birth. That, for example, includes hepatitis B, and that also has aluminum adjuvants in it, right? And then they mentioned that out of those 18 aluminum adjuvant-based vaccines, about 13 of those will be injected into a child by 18 months of life. And even if you look at from 1990 till present, something like, even though the industry is trying now to look for other possible adjuvants besides aluminum, then since 1990 till present, the increase of aluminum adjuvants increased by 25% in what we're injecting into children, based on increase of vaccines that are being injected into children. So basically the idea could be that we could be microdosing aluminum, and that aluminum could be getting into our brain. So, and how could it be getting into a brain? Well, there is this protein called macrophage chemoattractant protein 1, and that basically, it carries a signal that tells the macrophage how to get to the brain, right? So some individuals, for example, could have issues. So because why is not everyone affected, for example, by that? And they're saying like some individuals might not have properly brain barrier function working, the blood-brain barrier function working. So perhaps these macrophages can get into the brain easier than they should be. And what is the blood-brain barrier? Basically, the cells that make up the blood vessels going inside the brain, they are packed much tighter than everywhere else in the body, and that basically prevents anything easily getting outside of the blood into the brain. So this allows the brain to tightly control what can get inside it. So that's the blood-brain barrier. And another thing is that, for example, if someone has too much of that macrophage chemoattractant protein 1, they also could be ending up with too much of these macrophage immune cells inside the brain, delivering these aluminum adjuvants. Okay, so that could be basically the premise behind why is this happening, and do we have any evidence for that? Well, and of course, that's also just childhood vaccination. I should also tell you, there's also prenatal vaccines that pregnant women can take that also are aluminum based as well, and pertussis vaccine or whooping cough. So that's an example of that. And basically, here, what's happening is there's absolutely no knowledge as to how safe that is. We again assume it's safe, but we have no studies at all. These authors mentioned that as far as they know, there's only 2 studies ever that investigated what might be happening with aluminum adjuvants after it's been injected into a pregnant animal. And these 2 studies are in rats, and that's it. And one was based on just an aluminum adjuvant, and the other one was a vaccine that had aluminum adjuvants. And that's it. That's the only knowledge we've ever have done. So really, this constitutes another scientific gap. We just assume that it's safe, but we really don't know what's happening. And we do know that aluminum compounds can be transferred via placenta to the fetus from the mother. So we do know that. So, but how safe is it afterwards? We don't know. So, but we do also know that these aluminum adjuvants can cross blood-brain barrier. They can help it open it up. So there's that element. This has been shown via animal studies as well. And another thing we know is that it persists, and once it gets inside the brain, it's pretty much gets stuck in there. It looks like there is no really good recycling mechanism, so it can accumulate in the brain. And again, this is pretty much only done via animal studies as well. All right, so then this is the proposed theory that perhaps we're having issues with autism because of microdosing of aluminum in the brain from some of the vaccines that carry these aluminum adjuvants. And another thing is that how much aluminum adjuvant is introduced into a vaccine is also not controlled. And it can vary from vaccine shot to vaccine shot. So what we're talking about here is that studies show that they can vary up to even 2-fold between same batches of the same vaccine. So there's just simply a lot of unknowns here. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the evidence. So clearly, aluminum-based neurotoxicity, some of the symptoms that are exhibited from such neurotoxicity are also observed in people with autistic syndrome disease. Okay, so there's that. Most of evidence comes from animal studies. So the authors quoted that there's about 31 studies that show that aluminum adjuvants do indeed lead to behavioral changes in animals once they are injected in certain quantities to animals that exhibit autism-like behavior changes. So, and that included these two studies on pregnant rats. Okay, and in total, these studies included rodents, so mice or rats, rabbits, and maybe sheep. Right, and so we have that information. But it's the human studies that are quite interesting. So in 2011, someone actually wanted to really determine this. Could there be a link between aluminum amount in the vaccines and autism? And they studied this investigating Bradford Hill's criteria of causality. So they actually really wanted to investigate whether there could be causal relationship between the aluminum adjuvants and autism. And they investigated data in a number of Western countries. And this is what they concluded. This is what they basically came up with. So number one was that in these Western countries, the more aluminum adjuvants that was present in vaccines correlated with more autism cases. In the United States, over the 2 decades, the increase in aluminum adjuvants in the vaccine shots also correlated with increased level of autism. But the next 2 points are especially interesting. Number 3, they showed that in 7 Western countries, the amount of aluminum and adjuvants injected into children between the age of 3 to 4 months indeed was associated with increased level of autism, and this exhibited causal relationship based on the based on the typical criteria of causality that is being investigated. And by the way, I did not read this paper. I'm just repeating everything I read in these reviews. So I don't know whether this paper has been, for example, renounced later on, or denounced, I should say, for mistakes or not. So I'm just telling you what I was reading in these reviews from merely just 2 years ago. So there's that. And the final point of that study from 2011 was the most important one, I thought, the biggest point. And that was that if you delayed any vaccines with aluminum adjuvants in the first month of life of a baby, then you reduce the risk of autism in boys by more than threefold. So that, I thought it was incredible finding if this is true. Okay, and then one more study that they mentioned is in 2018 they actually did autopsies on cadavers of people who died who were diagnosed with autism at the moment of their death, and they looked at the amount of aluminum in the brains, and they compared it against what would be assumed healthy individuals, so people who did not have autism. And such healthy individuals in these sections that they were investigating on average had maybe 1 microgram of aluminum per gram of dry weight of brain. Okay, so that would be the normal standard, whatever normal standard of how much aluminum you can have in your brain is. But when you compared it to the autistic cases, then that amount of aluminum was much higher in when they made that comparison, which was between, I believe it was between 2 to 4 micrograms per gram of dry weight of brain. So substantially higher. But of all of the different autistic cases they were looking at, they also discovered in some cases the highest amount of aluminum inside the brain ever recorded, ever. And that was even more than 20 micrograms of aluminum per gram of dry brain weight. So excessively higher amount of aluminum. So this concept could potentially be true. We don't know. That's all the evidence that we have. But then let's assume that maybe it could be true. Then how could it work? How would aluminum be causing potentially something like autism? And now we're finally getting to the final part of the video, and it's the fact that it's your immune system that is very important in the proper development of your brain. So this is actually very well worked out, that your properly functioning immune system in your early stages is actually key in your brain development. And if you overactivate your immune system, then studies show that this can actually lead to neurological conditions, and this is actually well worked out. So now we have actually a new paradigm where a lot of our neurodevelopmental diseases actually are linked to the inappropriate overactivation of the immune system at the early stages of life. Okay, and that can include autism. So what's happening there? And then do we have any links to the autism? Yes, we do. The role of immunity is very closely linked to autism. We have already known that. And so, for example, they mentioned that it's very well known that pregnant women who get infected during pregnancy, they have increased risk of giving birth to children with autism. So there's one example. Autistic children are also known to show inflammatory markers in their cerebral spinal fluid, for example, or in certain cells isolated from their blood. So there's definitely some evidence. This has also been very well established in animal studies as well, that if you overactivate immune system, and that includes those activation of that microglia. Remember I mentioned that at the very beginning of the video, those immune cells inside your brain, their overactivation early in the development of the brain can lead to autism-like conditions in animals apparently as well. So there is definitely links between the immunity and autism. But how is this actually happening? And this is where it gets the most interesting part. that I'm gonna tell you. This is again not their theory. Other people have been already talking about this. These guys are just simply summarizing it all for us. And they basically mentioned that it's the process of autophagy, because autophagy is closely linked to inflammation. They actually work concurrently with one another. And autophagy is this process that is probably most of you, if you've heard of it, it's very well known to be activated from fasting. And once autophagy is activated, it can swallow up old organelles inside our cells or old proteins. So it can even swallow up, help to destroy pathogens. And it's basically a process that helps to clean up things and making sure that our system is working well under conditions of stress. Okay, so it helps to basically maintain and clean up the system. But our brains and our nerve cells have very key role of autophagy in it. They have very specific role for autophagy in it, and that's for actually trimming the synapses on our neurons. So, and this is called synaptic pruning. Pruning, like literally like pruning your hedges or your bushes in a garden. That's what it's called. Or it can be also called the dendritic spine pruning. Why it's called like that is because dendrites are these little tentacles on your nerve cells that basically can interact with other nerve cells, and that's how communication between nerve cells happens between these synapses. So synapses can release chemicals, and then chemicals communicate to the next nerve cell what is happening. And what happens is when we're born, we have lots of these synapses, way too much. And as we keep growing up, our brain is start to figuring out which networks are used more often and which ones are not. So which ones are needed for proper development, for proper function in the environment you're born with, and you need to start cleaning up the excess of these synapses. So that's hence you do this pruning. You literally activate autophagy to start destroying them. You basically get rid of them, and over time you can get rid of like up to, they said in that article, up to 70% of that. Okay, so and that's that process of autophagy. So what the authors were mentioning is that perhaps this process is actually prevented, because it's known that indeed overactivation of the immune system and the microglial cells and causing inflammation in the brain can actually interfere with that process. And it has been shown that indeed it can reduce the levels of this pruning inside the brain. Now, do we have any evidence of that inside autistic brains? And the answer is from animal studies. Yes, that the animal studies have shown that, but we also have some evidence from humans as well. Again, work on cadavers have shown that once you reach adolescence, people who are not autistic have something like 50% of these dendritic spines or synapses removed, versus those with autism had only a small portion of it, something like 15 or 16% only, reduced in comparison to what would be seen in early childhood, like in infancy. So yes, indeed, that process seems to be also reduced in autistic. And remember the genetic component that I was telling you about? Those more than 100 genes that have been now linked to autism. Well, it turns out that a lot of these genes are heavily represented in the autophagy activation pathways. So there's also that component. All right, so basically this is the overall theory, that perhaps it's the aluminum base that is now deposited in the brain by accident because of the amount of aluminum present in the adjuvants can be taken up by macrophages, immune cells, and they can deliver it to the brain. And once it's delivered to the brain, it can start and introduce inflammatory reactions, and as a consequence start reducing autophagy present in the brain. And once you remove the autophagy component at the early stages of development, you then reduce the pruning of nerve cells. So basically, you have too many nerve connections than you're supposed to as an autistic child, and this might basically lead to more like hyperactivation of the neuronal networks, more so than it's supposed to be there. And this is why you have that behavioral symptoms that you see with associated with autism. So that would be the ongoing theory. Okay, so now I never told you this yet, but these authors, they don't just look at looking at problems. They also look at what would be the potential solutions. I should have said this earlier, and they have proposed certain medical interventions. I can tell you that, and I will do a follow-up video on this as well, because I can tell you that this medical intervention is now currently being studied for treatment of autism in clinical trials. So it's definitely interesting. I will continue studying their work, and I will make a video, follow-up video to this video as well on just that very topic. But what are the final solutions that the authors proposed? Okay, so let's start, and then this is going to wrap up this video. So the number one thing that they proposed that we should be doing is, let's investigate delaying injection of aluminum-based vaccines in the first month of life, just like based on that article from 2011. Let's start comparing different, or at least delaying. So don't get rid of these vaccines. Just simply start introducing vaccines with aluminum perhaps later in life, okay? So that maybe the effect of it is not as dramatic as it could be based on this theory. So let's investigate that via clinical trials. Number two, let's start investigating for more non-aluminum based adjuvants. So again, don't get rid of vaccines, simply look for other options. And I got to tell you, they mentioned this is already happening. The industry is responding. We're looking at for the development of novel adjuvants has been ongoing for the last couple decades. So one option was, for example, they mentioned, I think it was calcium phosphate, and they mentioned that that one is a natural organic compound present in our body. So perhaps, and it has been used in vaccines before. It appears that it's safe. Of course, remember, we thought aluminum adjuvants are completely safe as well. And that's still a prevailing dogma, right? Despite these crumbs of evidence that it might be an issue. So, maybe it will be same story we discover with other adjuvants as well. But other adjuvants are being also developed as well. One example they mentioned, one was based on squalene. That's a compound that might sound familiar to you, based on cosmetic industry. So there's new options that are being investigated, and that's great news, because perhaps we could be using the same vaccines, keeping our children safe, but maybe use the vaccine product even safer by having a different adjuvant. So there's that, and of course more clinical trials are needed. So I already mentioned we should be looking at different delivery time options. So that's number one. They also mentioned we should be investigating the genetics, because perhaps clearly there's some people that are more susceptible than others. I mentioned that it could be because of, say, how the blood-brain barrier works, number one, or number two, because that macrophage chemoattractant protein levels are too high, or number three, because of, for example, the autophagy system is too sensitive to not being activated properly at the right time. So we should be investigating genetic predispositions, because perhaps for some of these individuals, if the vaccine might be okay unless you have the genetic predisposition only, and then you might consider same vaccine but with different adjuvant. Okay, so there is also that we should be investigating. They also mention proper analysis of what is happening specifically with the biological journey of aluminum adjuvants once they are injected into pregnant women. What is happening to the fetus with that? Based on such injections, we need to learn more, or early on in life. We should figure out the proper kinetics of it as well. How long does it stay in the body? How much of it gets to the brain versus other organs? All of that still requires deep analysis. So, and in the end, they mention overall, there's a couple conclusions. They mention, look, as far as they know, their reviews point to the fact that the aluminum adjuvants are not safe as they were believed to be in the past. This is the evidence that claim that this is why it should not be considered safe, and that why we need other options. So, and it shows that you can't just assume things in science and go with it and have medical interventions based on assumptions. And number two, they also mentioned one of these papers also mentioned, look, just because scientists are pointing out certain issues with vaccines, they should not be labeled as anti-vaxxers at all, because this is simply the hard work of scientists that are trying to make sure that our medical interventions are simply getting better and better and better, which is basically the exact medical progress we've been seeing over time. And there's this resistance to to acknowledging that there might be issues with some of our medical interventions, whereas it makes much more sense to simply objectively analyze this information and figure it out and make it better. That's the goal. That's ultimately the goal. This is nothing to do with not using vaccines. This is strictly about with making use of vaccines even better. All right. I told you this was going to be a very long video, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Please leave me a comment what you think about this theory. Very, very interesting. Kind of, I didn't see it coming. Let me know if you heard of it even before. Let me know if you think that's total garbage as well. Please share. Please give us a like. This is how we grow. Also, please check out my Patreon account as well. We post additional other content there that doesn't make it to YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you again in another installment and last view of the medieval royal castle. And bye for now. Ciao, everyone.